I love that point, and I reflect back on Tom's opening comment for a question, can you explain blockchain? So
I could have been a complete anarchist and just gone,
Tom, do your homework.
Look
do
it
your
up.
homework. Look it up.
Do your homework, Tom.
So welcome to episode 3 of The Stream, an unscripted conversation with guests who reject the status quo with a bias for action in the world of water and beyond. My name is Tom Freyberg, together with co-host Will Sarni. Will, how are you?
Tom, I'm well. I feel like I'm coming out of the cave, and not that life is returning to normal, but it's returning to something.
And from the look of that shirt you're wearing, you've certainly dressed up for the occasion out of the cave. That is a Hawaiian number from the look of it.
Tom and Katrina, it is springtime, if not summer in the Rockies. So, God, it just felt wrong to go with flannel. So I hope this is not hurting your eyes.
Not at all. It's kind of potentially a little bit offensive to some, but not to us. That's fine. But you have nicely introduced our very, very first guest of the stream. I'm so excited. I know, right? Katrina Donaghy, come in. The co-founder and CEO of Civic Ledger, all the way from Australia. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'm just watching the sun rise over the horizon as we have this call. So thank you for having me on to be your first guest.
I know.
Thank you.
And you obviously got the memo about the dress code.
I did. I got the memo, such a rush out, because I normally don't wear flannels because I'm in Brisbane. And even though we're in autumn, it's still sitting around 26, 27 degrees. So it's a little bit hot at the moment. So perhaps I should have got the memo and pivoted to a Hawaiian shirt.
Katrina, next time email me and
I'll just check with you for the wardrobe.
Yeah, we'll go around Tom.
Will is head VP of fashion for the stream, so please always check with him. Well, I'm pretty amazed we managed to do this because it's 6 a.m. in Australia, 9:16 p.m. here in the UK, and 2 p.m. in the afternoon in Denver. So, amazing that we're bridging 3 continents together through the beauty of telecommunication call and the stream. So, where can we start? Because we've got so much to talk about with you, Katrina. So, I want to start because you're involved in blockchain, right? That's kind of your baby, and you're a thought leader in this space. So, I think most people listening will have a vague idea of what blockchain is. Many will be experts, but just to kind of get us started, for people who still are not quite sure, what is blockchain, or they need a reminder, maybe you can just kick off by kind of in your own words and in your own time, just...
In my own time, we've got 2 years. No, we don't have 2 years, because it's funny, because every time I get asked this question, I'm always like going, what's the best way? And I always like to just cut through it and talked really about the high level elements. So if I was to reference the UN, because the UN are amazing at putting some really easy concepts. So it's basically a type of software that's made up of records that are of digital transactions that are grouped together into what we call blocks. And they become secure, and then they're shared across a shared network of computers. And I think what is the uniqueness of this technology is that every time there's a change to that transaction, there is a block added to that transaction. So you can't erase what's happened in the past, which is very different to centralized databases where you have an essential authority that has the control about what goes in and what goes out and what can be changed and things like that. So when we think about a system of record, you want to know as a consumer, or if you're in that transaction, that nobody's changing that data to change whether you own something or whether you've exchanged something. So blockchain is great for in the new digital world of exchanging value, which is probably a great pivot into why water is so opportunistic with this technology, because it's about exchanging value and having a record of the transaction.
So traceability, and also increased security and the speed of the transaction as well. There's quite you hear a lot about the benefits of what blockchain can offer. But Will, what's your sort of experience of blockchain and digital in water specifically? What are your thoughts on blockchain?
Sure. So, my view is that blockchain is one of the digital tools that can be applied to the world of water. I think probably out of all the digital tools, it's the most misunderstood. People immediately go to cryptocurrency and it's like, well, what does a token have to do with water? And I'm not really convinced that many people are doing it well in terms of, there's a lot of noise, a lot of chatter about it, but there are really very few companies that have a viable business model, value proposition, and I'll sound like a consultant, clients, someone that's going to pay for you to do what you do. So I see it as a very promising digital technology and essential to the digital transformation of the water sector.
Agreed. And it's true, it's a tool. It's not, and I think that's what's happened in the past, where everyone was coming out and saying, it's going to save the world, it's going to bring world peace. And there was a lot of expectation put on the technology, but you have to remember too that we're at the start of the third internet. So there's a lot of building that needs to happen. So we're now, 11 years into the tech, because if we think about the Bitcoin technology, we're still getting there with terms of the infrastructure. We know it works, but it's how we put it into the hands of the people to which we're solving the problem for. That's where it starts to get a bit sticky, because it's very difficult to say, here's a digital wallet, here, store your assets with a private key, and if you lose the key, well, too bad, so sad. And that's where things get a little bit complicated, and you've got to change the way you design the solutions.
I cut you off, Tom.
You didn't cut me off. Well, you go first.
Okay. So Katrina, why water? I mean, like what not possessed you, but what was the trigger? What was the moment that you said, hey, this water thing, I think it's perfect for blockchain? And some people would say, oh my goodness, you've got a technology company and you're going to enter the world of water. I mean,
I think there's so many ways to answer that question, but first and foremost, I came from water. So I came from government. So I worked in Brisbane City Council and I worked in the flood management team. And I was there when the city flooded. I saw how important technology was to ensure the public had confidence that they weren't going to die. And the role of information in timely way was so critical. And then I did a stint in Queensland Urban Utilities, which is a water utility company in Brisbane, sort of designing a future utility. What would a future utility look like? And again, it gets back down to the user experience. Cut a long story short, having a background in water and data, being a humanities graduate, was a little bit interesting to bring all of that together. But we just came off the back of delivering a digital experience, transforming a license or a permit from a paper-based asset into a digital asset. So we looked at a process where you were issued an entitlement, and we digitized that through the blockchain. So when the Australian government put out the challenges back in 2016, one of the challenges that was in that particular program was, how do we increase transparency and water information to bring confidence to the water market? And I sat down with Lucas, who's my co-founder, and I said, Lucas, look at this problem. It's really interesting. And he just looked at me and he said, yeah, we can solve that.
Just like that.
And that was that.
Those are good partners to have.
And it was like, okay. So, but the co-founders actually have experience with water. So Grantley Males, who's our co-founder, he did two terms as Chief Digital Officer for the Victorian government, for the South Australian government. But as a child, he grew up in the Murray-Darling Basin. So as a child, he knew what it was like to have water scarcity and complexity of water trades.
Mm-hmm.
And then Fraser was also introduced to me. So I had a great team around me, and we put the application in, got the offer from the Australian government. We worked with the Australian government for 3 months, delivered a feasibility study. But what was so critical was not to put the technology first and put the challenge into it. We had to really assess what was the problem and then come back and say, well, what is the best tools that we have that are different to how we look at the problem in Australia at the moment? And that was blockchain technology.
That's a good business strategy.
Yeah,
I mean, in terms of, what's the problem you're trying to solve, as opposed to, I've got a hammer and I'm going to find that nail.
Yeah. And what we found too was that the Australian government's problem statement was incorrect. So after we tested the hypothesis, again, using critical thinking and analytical thought, we looked at the problem. We said, look, we think it's actually the water trading that's really hard to solve rather than water information. We found that water information is available, it's clunky, but it's available. And that's when we designed Water Ledger. And a lot of people don't know, but we actually got to the end of the feasibility study to do the next stage. And we were rejected by the Australian government. They said, no, we think that the technology is too immature, and the regulatory arm of the water markets wouldn't be able to adapt to take on this technology in the time frame that was required to move to the next stage. So we got rejected. So
that's often the catalyst to go on and improve and come back again, right?
Rejection
right. is needed to spark the next evolution of the business, right?
You never say no to an entrepreneur. You never say no to an entrepreneur. That's like saying, so we basically just parked water, and we did some other interesting stuff around intellectual property. We worked with IP Australia around digitizing patents and creating two-sided marketplaces. And that was an amazing project, and that we got taken to Geneva to present our work into the WIPO community. But water was always there. And if you know Australia, you can't go a day without something in the media around the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. You cannot pick up your newspaper. And I guess the catalyst was that as soon as we were delivering the feasibility study in June 2017, the Four Corners program broke with the corruption. So all of a sudden it blew up into this political ball, and we were like thinking, this is going to be buried. But now 5 inquiries later, and we're just about to announce at the end of this month, the ACCC has been doing an inquiry into the water markets, and they're just about to announce their interim findings, which we feel that they're going to push for interoperability between the registries. And the only way you can get interoperability is through this technology. So I think we've timed it really quite well.
So this is about the open platform, right? In terms of, we were talking before for the water trading rights,
And what's quite critical when you look at blockchain technology, you get a lot of pushback about, well, it's got to be closed, it's got to be permissioned, it's got to be private. And we get not harassed, but we get asked a lot about, well, why are you using the public blockchain? And our answer is that when you look at entitlements, whether it be water, be land, natural assets, physical assets, there's 4 components in an entitlement. There's the rights, responsibilities, restrictions, and interests. So if you overlay that with water, you have interests. So you have a public interest. And in Australia, taxpayers fund water. We pay for water through environmental buyback. So we have an interest. So it's important that information is discoverable on a public registry. It can't be shrouded. It can't be opaqued. It must be discoverable, but securely. And that's why we use the public blockchain.
It's interesting. I think it's an incredibly complicated process in terms of the water trading rights, with so many stakeholders, with so many data points, right? So to try and simplify that using blockchain is an amazing thing to do. But yeah, I mean, how are you kind of looking in terms of then expanding internationally? How are you kind of moving from Australia? You mentioned about coming to pitch into Geneva.
Yeah, well, Geneva was with our intellectual property rights. So WIPO finally started looking at blockchain to look at securing intellectual property, because intellectual property moves across jurisdictions. Just because you register your IP in Australia doesn't mean you don't want to register it in another country. But that's really hard to do. It's very expensive. And there are a lot of lawyers that make a lot of money because of the opacity of the intellectual property trades. But there's synergies with water too. But I think we can't lead with water markets outside of Australia, because Australia's got very mature water markets, and we've got good governance, and we've got good understanding of putting a value on water. So if you go to other countries that don't have water markets and you start saying, oh, by the way, you're going to start paying for water, you can imagine if you don't have the governance in place and the rules in place, you're going to have uproar. You're going to have people say, what, you're going to tell me now to start paying for water that I've been extracting for free for the last 100+ years? Crazy. So we're leading under the guise of water license, because if you go into other countries, you've got a natural language around water license, which Bill could probably build upon. So we're leading into Europe through the Water Tech Accelerator with Gaetine Disnet and Jacob Tompkins, to explore how we can find a pilot in Europe. But what I am finding, which I'm quite surprised, is I sort of had the impression that there was high levels of digital literacy. Apparently not. So we're having to change our language quite a bit, which is quite interesting.
I think that's probably a good segue into, what it would look like for you to move into the U.S. market, in particular the American West, which, has water policy from the 19th century and has no shortage of challenges. I actually think there's really a promising opportunity for you here, in particular in the West, because, our water is over allocated and, somewhat, archaic in terms of how it's managed. So driving transparency into the system would be welcomed, if not absolutely critical at this stage of the game, so people understand how this works, what doesn't work, what needs to be fixed, and so on. And it's clearly a longer conversation, but I'm excited by the prospect of what blockchain can do in the American West to better manage an incredibly scarce resource out here.
Yeah, we looked at the US. I mean, the US was a catalyst. I mean, as we were starting to explore elements in Australia, I mean, the Colorado, when we saw like last year that your government was proposing a bill where blockchain had to be explored in the water space, we just lost our mind. We're like, this is great. You've got a government body in another country directing their water authority to investigate water transparency with blockchain tech. So where Katrina, is it at?
Occasionally you get it right, and sometimes we sort of nail this whole innovation thing.
But it's fascinating because normally regulators must be agnostic, really seriously agnostic, but to put that word in your bill was amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, every state, as you probably know, is pretty different. I mean, state of California is really doing some very interesting things around open data and innovation. They actually passed the Open Data and Transparency Act a couple of years ago. I think right around the time they passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So in terms of, public policy coming into the 21st century, there's some real hope out there in terms of, the public sector thinking about how to manage, that gallon of water more efficiently and effectively, and using digital tools like yours to make it happen.
What about in terms of digital citizens? because I think we've touched upon trading and at a governance level, but they often talk about the use of digital tools to try and get people more interested in water. And I think if people can kind of think, oh, you know, Bitcoin's kind of quite cool, and blockchain, more and more people are understanding it. But I think in terms of the potential from the cybersecurity point of view, because obviously in terms of personal data, addresses, bank details being used for the exchange to underpin and secure those details, and when people understand just how secure blockchain can be, and it means that by paying for their water bills, it's more secure than any other method. I think that could be a real sell to the wider audience of the benefit of blockchain.
It's ensuring that you're actually building in the right incentives into the solution to ensure that people can actually be motivated. So we have, speaking of privacy, even though we're using the public blockchain, we're incorporating the DAML, which is the digital asset management language, contract coding language, into the technology, because we want to make sure that that financial transaction and any financial data is actually secure and private and opaque, because there's no interest. You know, the person down the road doesn't need to know that what you've actually financially traded with each other. But we do need to have price and volume, but we don't need to have bank details and all of those elements if there's any financial components associated with the trade. So working with the Australian Securities Exchange has been fantastic, because we're showing that we can take their solution that they're building for the Australian Securities Exchange in Australia to replace their CHESS system, and show how it can be applied in other use cases in a really elegant way, which is the goal of technology. You want to show that you can interoperate, that you can take other parts and build it together. So therefore, we're not going back to the whole silo systems where, you know, proprietary systems refuse to talk to other proprietary systems, or you've got to pay a lot of money to get access, or you give up data or your identity, various things for convenience. These are the things that we have to start challenging. And we're hoping that through the pilot work we do up in Queensland, that we can prove out that we can have privacy and security, but transparency at the same time.
I love how you talk about the digital citizen. And, you know, for me, I think that's going to change how we manage water, because digital is in every other part of our life, and water is a little late to the party. So I like your narrative. I like how you're talking about digital citizens and what does that mean, and you know what that could mean for the water sector.
Do you think our current situation in the world we're living in, where people have no choice but to use digital technologies in the pandemic and extra, is going to drive forward the need for blockchain, right? I mean, Will, you always talk about decentralized and democratized access. I mean, do you think this is going to accelerate the need, right? I mean, I don't want to talk too much. We've said we don't want to talk too much about, you know, COVID-19, etc. But inevitably, it's intrinsically linked to the digital acceleration in many industries.
I would bet $1, maybe $2. Yeah, absolutely. I think this has, you know, I think you've seen some of the things I've written that, you know, doubling down on digital and analog is dead, which is, you know, a bit extreme. But the point is that I think this is a huge wake-up call that you absolutely need digital to manage water in, you know, public sector, you know, private sector, utilities, whatever it may be. And it's about digital tools for the workforce, asset management, resource management. There was an article that I caught today, a research piece by Accenture, and that's not a product placement, by the way, talking about.
Although if they want to sponsor, it is available. No,
Tom,
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's not.
Hey, come on! I work for Deloitte. You know, go easy. But they made a really important point that basically what we thought was going to take 3 years for this digital transformation, we've seen in 3 months. And you know, we can argue about the timeframes, but the reality is there is so much more conversation around digital tools transformation, and that being, in the toolbox that the public and private sector now has. So, Katrina, I think, you're going to do well.
Yeah, but I still think what we've learned over the years too is that there's been so much talk about the tech. There's been so much overpromise and under-delivery. And so we're up against a little bit of, still a lot of skepticism. So we have to be very pin-focused around showing, because I even, have come to my, having those moments, even with my own industry, where I get really, or I look at other companies that talk about them being blockchain, and I see what they're doing or trying to build, and I just feel like saying, just put it down and walk away, because it's causing a lot of concern for us in the industry that are truly trying to build a different future, when we're constantly getting asked, but isn't it that crypto thing? Isn't it that ICO thing? Isn't that this? Isn't that that? And you're trying to get them back to looking at the problem and say, well, let's really look at the problem and ask ourselves why we haven't been able to solve it before. And it comes down to what we talk about a lot in this space, is around the tragedy of the commons. So when you have a finite asset, whether it be water, parklands, infrastructure, anything that's finite, you'll always have a vested interest. And then that vested interest turns into a controlling interest. Mm-hmm. And we see that all the time with water. So how do we actually address in the future, where water will become much more scarce and more scarce and more scarce, that we're not going to, how do we prevent war? How do we prevent conflict? And I keep on having that at the back of my mind whenever I get up in the morning and I think about the pilot and what we're building and why are we doing it? Why are we doing this? This is about to solve the problem, the tragedy of commons.
I think it's good. That's your why. Will, we've had the conversation about a company's purpose and the why.
Right.
And I think you've almost just outlined it there very succinctly, Katrina. That's kind of your get out of bed and the why of your business, which is great.
Yeah, well, I think water underpins humanity. And I mean, even now we're seeing with COVID, we've got to wash our hands. So what about those communities that don't have access to clean water? How are they coping? How are they doing their workarounds? So we've got to be cognizant that water is part of our lives, but we mistreat it because we don't see it. We're sort of like, yeah, it comes out the tap, it goes down the sink, and irrigators use it, but we really need to understand that this is a finite asset. We've got to be respectful of it. So how do we better govern it? And I guess that's what I get really excited about this tech, coming from humanities background and philosophy and ethics and political theory. And this technology asks us those questions all the time. When you get up and ask the question, every time you use it, build a user story, or you're looking at how to solve the problem, you keep going back to the first principles. Why do we need to have this information? Who needs it? How do we govern it? What are the business rules? How do we verify that this data is correct? Where do we put it? Why do we put it there? Because it's there forever. So you can't just make a snap decision and say, yep, that's going in there. You've got to be thinking clearly and say, well, what happens in 20 years' time? Is that data going to become somebody's poison?
But the thing is,
big responsibility.
The thing that I find really interesting when I was reading earlier, actually, you mentioned Emma Weisbord and her various papers for the IWA. She gave a great analogy that the blockchain stops the data being manipulated. So if you, a very great analogy she used was, if you have a picture of a face that every computer is validated, if someone was to draw a mustache on that face, every other computer on the network will say, hang on, this is alien, this is an anomaly, it won't happen. So if you take that analogy to, financial figures, to data, you cannot change anything in a couple of years from now because everything it's underpinned on won't allow it. So I think it stops corruption, it stops manipulation of the data, it stops the politics kind of creeping into it as well.
Well, we hope so, but it has to be underpinned. Like, the tech is just the tech. It's tech, but it's how you think about it, how you design, how you put the governance in it, and how we as humans take that responsibility. Because at the end of the day, we can make the tech do whatever we want it to do. But just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. And you've got to have those clear governance. You've got to hold yourself accountable. And that's where you get back to your values as a company. You know, what's our purpose? Why do we do this? And make sure that those values are quite clear when you communicate. So we put all our code on GitHub. To a lot of people, they go, are you crazy? Where's your IP? And we go, look, we know where our IP is, but we need our code to be, we need it to be scrutinized. We need the other development community to look at it and say, is that the right way to use the technology? Because that's very, very important to get confidence and to validate us that we're actually doing it, you know, that we're actually building the tech in the right way.
That's powerful.
It's a big call.
Well,
but you need to be open source.
Right. You know, for me, transparency and traceability is a powerful change agent. So, you know, when people say, well, you know, why do you need the data? You know, you can counter that with, why shouldn't everybody have the data, the information, you know, turn into something that's actionable? You know, that's how you drive innovation in public policy and, you know, new business models. So, yeah, I see that as an incredibly powerful catalyst for innovation.
Because you can't solve all the problems in the ecosystem. So if you're going to create the infrastructure layer, then it's your duty to create opportunity for other startups to come along and build an application on your platform that is interoperable with what you're building. So you get that really rich ecosystem where the data is moving across different layers, but we all agree on its provenance. We all agree on what its value is. And that's going to be really interesting. So I know we're a few years away, so I can't really say, you know, what is, I sort of probably a vision that we've got about another 2 years to go with our products in Australia, particularly, before it's going to be everywhere, where it'll be just this ubiquitous little layer that'll underpin applications, and what you'll see either on the page or in the browser is a little chain to verify that all your transactions are secure through the blockchain technology platform. And that's all you'll need to know.
What is it you said yesterday, Katrina? You said blockchain is successful when you don't have to explain what blockchain is, right?
Yes.
When people, it's almost like when the internet came up, people were like, what is the internet? How does it work? Where does it sit? Which server, you know, which data center? And now people just kind of, it's taken for granted, right? It's
yeah, like email. We don't have email meetups group. Like we have blockchain meetups at the moment because it's really critical that we get community and all this sort of stuff. But the success is when it's like Fight Club. You don't talk about Fight Club. It's like you don't have to talk about it anymore. We just agree on it. We agree on its purpose. We agree on what it actually does. We just go build with it, and we don't have to spend you know, a lot of our time educating, because I sort of have. I'm at the point now where it's not to be disrespectful to my audience, but I sort of ask the question, well, why should I be telling you? It's all out there. You know, it's on YouTube. You know, all the big accounting companies continually, you know, put out publications. So just do some searching. Get yourself engaged. Get yourself informed. Don't ask someone else to explain it to you, because this is important technology to understand. And so it's a lot more easier to understand now.
So Katrina, I love that point, and I reflect back on Tom's opening comment or question, you know, can you explain blockchain? So
I could have been a complete anarchist and just gone,
Tom, do your homework.
Look
it up. Do your homework. Look it up.
Do your homework, Tom.
Because I've got we've got an amazing colleague here in Australia, Dr. Pip Ryan, and I adore Dr. Pip Ryan, and she's leading the because I don't know, a lot of people don't know that it's Standards Australia that's leading, is the Secretariat for the Standards of Blockchain Technology. A lot of people don't know the great work that Australians have done. Anyway, we have Dr. Pip Ryan, who's a barrister, and she's at the Australian National University, and she's overseeing the TC 307, which is the working group on the standards for the smart contract. It's called ISO TC 307. And she actually she took a screenshot, I think when she very first Googled blockchain or something like that. And I think she returned about 1,073 results, early days. Now, if you put blockchain into your Google search engine, it just goes, trillions. But it's just to remember that there was a time where this was extremely not known. And we used to have blockchain conferences where we used to sit at, I remember in 2017, and our great developing community would stand up and do the whole blockchain 101 over and over and over again. Thank God we don't do that anymore. But we've come a long way.
Well, the discussion has moved, isn't it, from the what to the how, in terms of how is it being implemented? Because you're right, you only have to Google search, and Will, I did actually Google search blockchain.
I was just giving you a hard time.
No, I know. But you're right. I mean, PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, they put out reports. I think your former company, Will, I won't mention it, Deloitte, has reports out in terms of the potential of blockchain across healthcare. Basically, any business that has a supply chain is actively looking and implementing blockchain to some degree, right?
But the challenge is that you've got these amazing glossy documents that, you get the interns working really hard to put together with lovely infographics and stuff like that. And it goes out there, then it goes on a sales cycle. The challenge is that when you actually want to work with the people that really need to understand and have this technology adopted, they're like disconnected. They're in a completely different world because their constraints are different. Their pressures are different. So the last thing they want to do is come around and start playing around with an untested technology. It's especially with dealing with government, which are extremely risk averse. But as we were talking about before, this COVID has been an extraordinary experience where all of a sudden workforces have been mobilized to work from home, when we always did have the work from home policy. We've had it for like 10 years, but it's always seen as suspicion. Oh no, you can't work from home because you won't work, or you won't participate, or we can't see you, so we can't see that you're going to be accountable. Well, guess what? We all work from home, and we do turn up in checkered shirts, and we do our jobs. And what have we got in benefit? And Hawaiian shirts, but we've got more time now. We've got more time. We don't have to commute. We don't have to sit in cars and sit in traffic and do that whole, because what we've worked out because I was on a call with Queensland government yesterday, and we have one big government building in Queensland, in Brisbane, called 1 William Street. If they want to get people back into that building, it's going to take 2 hours. Under the social distancing rules, to get thousands of people back into a building, 2 hours. So you sort of go, we're not going back.
We're definitely not going back to the way it was, nor should we.
Yes. So what's next then? So what's the next conversations we have?
Well, I think it gets to, certainly what is the trajectory of the digital transformation of water, but, also what does work look like? And
exactly.
Again, I put my money that it's going to be some sort of a hybrid model. I think people do need to socialize and be together, but not all the time.
For
everything. I mean,
exactly.
The notion that I have to have a face-to-face meeting with you all the time, not so much, so.
No.
I remember a few years ago, in a previous magazine, the boss of a PR company, a friend of mine, we were on a press trip, and he said, this was way pre-COVID, he was going to close down his office, let all his team work from home, and then hire a centralized office in London once a month to bring his team to. This was back in 2009. And now I'm hearing this same line we were on a call the other day, and the CEO of a British association said exactly that. She's thinking of having a centralized office for those team meetings. Again, Katrina, you mentioned that will be completely changed, how people enter the room, maybe even the desk is spaced out.
Exactly.
But I think there's been a culture shift that would have taken years has taken
Right.
2 months
I
almost. It's
know,
been
I
completely
know,
accelerated.
exactly. And that's really quite an opportunity. And I think for all of us in this conversation that are already, you know, on the other side, we've been in that room, the digital room, for years and years, waiting for the rest of the rooms to get too toxic, you know, too difficult to be in, that they had to come into our room. But I guess that's what is, I would be really disappointed if we go back to the normal. You know, if we went back to that room and said, you know what, let's go back and get back in our cars and go back to analog and still require people to use paper, and we'll use all of these people to check that everyone's doing the right thing. But I'm curious on how we take that next conversation. Whether water utilities particularly are sitting down and with their executive teams and going, you know what, the rule book has changed. What does the new rule book like? What do we start drafting first? And it's the digital customer, and rebuilding an entire water utility around the digital customer, and a digital supply chain, and a digital water, digital infrastructure, digital assets, digital twins. Redesign a whole brand new workbook, and be brave to ask for help, because you're not going to have the knowledge inside your organizations right now. You will not. So reach out, get to the startup community, bring them in, and let them help you transform. Go the startups first. Always. My plug.
Well done.
Because we're the ones that can move faster, and we don't charge it, you know, we don't charge $1 trillion just to walk into the room. Yeah, because that's another challenge for us, is that, you know, when we start talking about digital transformation of government, there's so many war stories, and the public servants just look at you and they just like go, no, not another tech project. I can't cope. Because of the old ways of delivering technology. It's been so hard. So Will, what's your thinking about Colorado? Do you think that your leaders are going to, because I believe that the bill is still under negotiation in terms of directing a digital water experience for Colorado? Is that happening?
You know, I don't know. Well, I don't know what's going to happen, but we do have a state water plan. There are people very much engaged in terms of how to implement that water plan. And right now there's a conversation around, well, what did we learn from the pandemic, and has it changed not just the the public utility sector, but also businesses in the state of Colorado. So I'm an optimist, and I believe that this has made a lasting impression, and people now value the power of digital technologies, and will invest in certainly the technology piece of the puzzle, but I would argue more importantly the people side of the equation. And you touched on this, Katrina, which is how do you get people comfortable? How do you get them to be brave and say, okay, I knew nothing about the web however many years ago, and now I use it all the time. And how could this be any different? So I think we've been propelled into the future quickly. Fast. So I'm not sure what's going to happen in the state, other than there is intent, and that's a good place to start.
That's amazing. Like, I mean, I guess this is why I love this conversation that we're having. I'm in Australia, Tom, you're in the UK, and Will, you're in the US. But I know so much about I know so much about what Colorado is doing without even having to get on a plane. When the work that Colorado were doing came up on our radar. I remember making calls with Austrade, which is our government trade body, and saying, get me into people in Colorado. I want to make connections, because this is amazing. And I love the fact that we can actually do that, we talked about Emma and Anna, who are critical, amazing humans in the way they think about this technology and water. And I met them a number of years ago just through random forums or LinkedIn or publications and things like that. that we're all coming together under this common thing called water. We're so motivated.
Water's good glue.
Water is the glue that binds us together, with the stream linking together 3 continents. What a perfect way to bring our conversation to an end.
There we go. Got a new tagline.
The glue. Well, first of all, we had the flannel that holds us together. Now it's moved on, right? It's evolving. Well, guys, I think we're around the 45-minute mark, if I'm right. Although I to be honest, I have lost track of time a little bit because the conversation has flowed well as we thought it would.
There's the pun.
I know.
Was that number 3? Was that 3?
I wasn't counting, but maybe. But Katrina, thank you so much for joining us as our very first guest and for giving us more information on blockchain. Will, always a pleasure. Any kind of final thoughts or recaps from you to end this marvelous episode?
Oh, gee, you
sorry, I just threw you right at the end there.
No, I'm only kidding.
Just go to my first question. What is blockchain?
I guess the only thing I would add is that, while we're embracing the digital transformation of water and how much is accelerated, really need to focus on people, the people end of it. And we need to make investments in workforce, those digital citizens that you referenced, Katrina, absolutely critical. None of this is going to happen as quickly as we would hope, unless we invest in people.
Yeah, it's about in lifting the digital literacy, allowing people to be okay in asking, can we do things better? Why are we doing things that way? I mean, I used to, I've had jobs where I've been sat, a long time ago. Thank God I'm my own company. That's probably why I have my own company. But, always been told that if you asked why, you were seen as difficult and problematic. We now need to be asking why more than ever.
Oh, yeah.
Always.
Never be afraid to ask that question. Yeah.
And hold people accountable. People who are decision making and investing money into programs, you've got to hold them accountable and say, well, why are we doing it that way? Is there a better way of doing something?
And I think, Will, to kind of close off on that digital citizen line, that what I've seen and read is that blockchain can be used to provide that accountability on any single product that we buy, whether it's through the buying of media items, through to even the steps in providing fair trade coffee from source until your house, right? If everybody involved in that supply chain is accountable and using something that can be traced, such as blockchain, it means that the digitally advanced and mature buyer can then look back to digitally find out that is the goods that they're buying are what they say they are.
Right.
I didn't really articulate that as sharp as I would want it to, but I think you kind of
well,
it comes back to coffee always.
Always comes back to coffee.
Yeah.
Really important for Katrina at 6:30, 7 in the morning. But this is probably worth another episode. But in the whole corporate social responsibility, sustainability world, we're at the prove it stage, phase of that, which is, brochures don't cut it anymore. People want to know exactly where things came from and how they were sourced, and that's a fair.
But on the other side too is actually supply chains are complex. They're spider webs, they're complex. But you actually have. This is where you get to, and I know we have to finish up, but this is probably a question for the next episode: is if you're in the supply chain and you're getting paid to participate, to be a person in that supply chain, and you're adding no value, do you want blockchain technology to interrupt your supply chain? And the answer will be probably no, because if you're seeing that you are taking value out of the transaction rather than adding value in, you are gone. So there will be people that will double down and say this cannot happen, because the more transparency, the more people have more information about saying, hey, you're taking more than your fair share, you're not adding any value, we can remove you out of the supply chain. And that's when things get really interesting.
So that comes down to fear of change and fear of that accountability, and also, yeah.
But if you've got economies that, you know, if you've got smaller economies that need those players to be in the supply chain, and you are going to remove them, and that has a roll-on effect to that economy, these are the things that we need to be considering when we look at transparency in supply chains and tech. We've got to look at the consequences and the ethics and the governance. And if there are no negative impacts to the economy, what public policy can be shifted or tweaked to allow a new economy to emerge? So you need to have a holistic point of view of an ecosystem, because it has a massive impact. If you're taking people out of their livelihood because they no longer fit that expectation, you will create conflict and you will drive opacity more into the transaction than ever before. So that's why it's not just about handing it over to the technology team to solve the problem. You've got to have philosophers and governance and all of those components in the story as well.
Katrina, I think that's part 2 of your hosting the show or guest.
No, it's just it's a really important piece that it gets lost because we get so excited. It's like, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and you go, hey, hang on.
Right.
You know, what does this impact on people's lives?
Yeah, people make money on inefficiencies.
They do. They make an efficiency. They make a lot of money on opacity and information asymmetry. Yep. All right. My turn to have coffee. I know, Tom, Tom's ready to hit the sack. Will, you're just about to have afternoon tea. And I'm going to have my first coffee.
Happy hour, Katrina.
Oh, it's the happy hour, of course.
We're getting remarkably close.
We've timed the whole recording of the stream around the happy hour in Denver, right? So
there we go. And I will have cocktails with little umbrellas, just
just with the theme of the shirt. I love it.
I'm expecting you to be next time in a banana lounge, lying down in a banana lounge with your Hawaiian shirt and with your cocktail.
Yeah, Tom will fire me.
Next one.
That's the case.
I think that's the summer edition. But Katrina, thanks for joining us from Australia. Will, always a pleasure. Thank you for listening, everyone.
See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye.